begin starting, I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for everybody who signed up for this panel. I really appreciate you all being here to learn more about labor trafficking by forced criminality and its impact on youth. I'm just going to right now talk a little bit about how what you can expect throughout this webinar and this panel. We're going to start off with introductions, and after the introductions, I'll give a broad overview of what labor trafficking by forced criminality is. And each of our panelists will then go on to talk about their areas of expertise. We will have a section for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar, so please hold on to your questions until then. But there is, if you see on here, there is a Q&A portion, so if you want to start putting your questions in there, that's perfectly fine. And we also have a survey that we would like for folks to fill out at the end of the panel. And as you can see, this panel is being recorded. So our hope is that within the next week or so, we'll be sending out a recording of the panel to everybody who is here. I want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Annabelle Martinez. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel with the Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative is. I want to also introduce our other panelists. With us today, we have Caitlin Sedales. She is the Associate Director of Research, Learning, and Advocacy for the Covenant House Action and Research Tank, Covenant House, New Jersey. She has co-authored and published research on labor trafficking by forced criminality and conducted a regional needs assessment on services for students experiencing homelessness. Caitlin is also a consultant for the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. Caitlin has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology and a master's degree in social work from Stockton University, where she serves as an adjunct professor. We also have with us today James Dold. He is the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids and oversees all programming and operations. Under his leadership, Human Rights for Kids has become a national authority on human rights issues affecting children in the United States, with his influential report inspiring legislative changes nationwide. Before joining Human Rights for Kids, James was the Advocacy Director and Chief Strategy Officer for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, and helped significantly reduce life without parole sentences for children. He's also a survivor. He also led a Polaris project. He led a campaign to result in 40 new anti-human trafficking laws, and is a survivor of child labor trafficking and sexual abuse, and has championed crucial legislative efforts based on his experiences. He's also on the board of directors for the Survivors Alliance and holds a dual degree in criminal justice psychology from UNLV and a law degree from the University of Maryland. With us today is also Aja Howe. Aja is a human trafficking survivor leader, mother of 4, and an advocate. She graduated from Santa Rosa Junior College and is currently a public affairs candidate at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. On her journey, she came to realize the importance of spreading awareness about combating trafficking. She also came to acknowledge how valuable survivor empowerment is, because trafficking policies do not currently reflect fair and just policy. The survivors deserve. Aja has made public affairs an area of focus of her life. And last but not least, we have Jimmy Lopez. Jimmy Lopez is a survivor of child labor trafficking. He fled Honduras to avoid being recruited by gangs at the age of 14. This took him on a journey that transcended across neighboring countries in search of better opportunities. He lived alone in Mexico for a few years and eventually met a man who offered him a way into the US. Unfortunately, once he arrived at the US, he was trafficked both in a furniture factory and then later on trafficked in a restaurant and forced to transport drugs, which led him to being arrested. And it was not until his public defender who was able to connect him with services for trafficking survivors, and that's when they realized that he was a trafficking survivor. And he's now an advocate for other children who have similar experiences. And later on, Each one of our panelists will go on to share a little bit about themselves and their work. And so what I want to get started off with first, Sabra, if you can get with slide number 7, it's a little bit of the work that Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative is, who Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative is. So as you can see from here, we're a community-informed think tank. So our main focus here at Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative, which is based out of Loyola Law School, is that we focus on anti-trafficking policy, both on the local, meaning Los Angeles City, Los Angeles County, and state level, California. We try to ground our work in intersectional framework, and we work from 4 key pillars, which is government accountability, racial justice, immigrant justice, and climate justice and economic justice. When it comes to our work on labor trafficking by first criminality, we focus it on the government accountability because we try to ensure that government agencies are being held accountable to ensure that they're serving both youth and adult survivors of labor trafficking by first criminality, and also under immigrant justice and racial justice, and you will see a little bit of why later on. And next slide. So some of you might be new to the concept of labor trafficking by first criminality, so you might be wondering, what is it? And so first, we can start off by defining what child labor trafficking is. So that is when a trafficker uses force, fraud, and coercion to compel a child to work. And when it comes to sex trafficking, the fact that a child is engaging in sex work, they're automatically seen as a victim of trafficking. But when it comes to labor trafficking, that is not the case. There will still need to be shown that there was force, fraud, or coercion. And when it comes to labor trafficking by first criminality, the labor that is being asked of the person to do is an activity that would otherwise be classified as a crime. Many individuals, including youth, are sometimes recruited into gangs and to perform criminal activities, and this is something James will touch on more later on in the presentation. And because of the fact that they're associated with a gang, they might not automatically be seen as a survivor of trafficking, let alone a survivor of labor trafficking by first criminality. And some examples of what youth who are labor trafficked by first criminality are forced to do are to cultivate and transport and sales of drugs, theft, shoplifting, recruiting, monitoring, arranging dates and other activities to support commercial sex and other crimes. Next slide. One thing that we wanted to also highlight is the issue of labor trafficking by first criminality immigrant youth. What we have heard from service providers throughout the state and even the country is that they are seeing an increase of unaccompanied minors who are seeking services, who are being trafficked. And the trafficking of immigrant minors can happen on their way to either in their home country as they're coming to the United States or here within the US. And some of the vulnerabilities that this immigrant youth have are language barriers, as you can imagine, being unfamiliar with their rights in the United States, not being legally allowed to work here, and then past trauma that compounds the vulnerability to exploitation. Also, many of the youth who come here are fully dependent on their sponsors, and sometimes their sponsor can be a parent, it can be someone who is a sibling, an aunt and uncle, or sometimes it's another person who's not related to them, so they're very vulnerable to the sponsor. Next slide. And as James will touch on a little bit later as well, I just want to re-highlight that sometimes immigrant youth, boys or youth that are seen to be involved, to be quote-unquote gang members, are not seen as victims of labor trafficking by forced criminality and are also not screened properly for that. And some of the examples that you can see some of the crimes they're forced to commit is street peddling, stealing, weapons trafficking, and along with physical violence. Next slide. And so some of the work that we are doing here at Sunita Jain is trying to address the issue of labor trafficking by forced criminality and youth, and trying to get Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City and its agencies to look at this issue and see its importance. And we see that there's a lack of awareness and training that's being conducted on this issue. And so we are hoping that Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City will take this issue more seriously and provide more support to youth who are labor trafficked by forced criminality. And essentially, we hope that they're going to be provided the same kind of support that are provided to youth who are being commercially sexually exploited. We see a lot of gaps within the legal system and policies to help youth who are labor trafficked by forced criminality. So we're looking to also change some of those policies to be inclusive of youth who are being labor trafficked by forced criminality, so that they're not criminalized for the crimes they're being forced to commit. Next slide, please. Some of the work that we're also doing is trying to help. We're part of the Child Labor Trafficking Steering Committee with DCFS. We're also part of their labor trafficking subcommittee, and we're helping DCFS to update their protocols and trainings to be inclusive of youth who are labor trafficked and also youth who are labor trafficked by forced criminality, and advocating for services to provide for them. We're also helping probation update their internal protocols and trainings, and also working with the public defenders to develop evidence-based labor trafficking by forced criminality screening tool of their clients. And countywide, we're trying to make sure that all trainings are about trafficking are also include labor trafficking and labor trafficking by forced criminality. Next slide. And now I'll turn over the presentation to Caitlin Sedales, who, Caitlin, would you be able to touch a little bit upon your research if you come across any data specific to LA County or LA City or in California, and also how the intersection between labor trafficking, forced criminality, youth who are homeless?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Annabelle. And thank you all for having me and for being here today to talk about this important issue. So as Annabelle said, I am from Covenant House, New Jersey. I'm the Associate Director of Research, Learning, and Advocacy there. And in 2022, Covenant House, New Jersey conducted research that resulted in a published journal article on labor trafficking by forced criminality. With Covenant House, New Jersey had some other experience in this area. We'd previously written a textbook chapter about labor trafficking by forced criminality. And so we had done some work in that area. So obviously I am not from New Jersey, so unfortunately I don't have my own data about forced criminality in California. However, that some research that had been done by Covenant House International, through Covenant House International by Laura Murphy, almost going on 10 years ago now, Laura Murphy did a 10-city study. And one of the cities in that study was Oakland and Los Angeles. So one of the findings was that the most common labor trafficking experience among young people experiencing homelessness in all 10 cities, but in California as well, was labor trafficking by forced criminality, specifically forced drug distribution. So there was, as I said, they looked at 98 cases in Oakland and Los Angeles. About 2/3 of them were in Los Angeles specifically. And what they found was that 9% of the participants that they interviewed had experienced labor trafficking, and that 80% of those labor trafficking cases specifically involved something in the drug trade. So be it drug distribution, drug smuggling, it was very specific to the drug trade. Their findings among labor trafficking experiences among youth experiencing homelessness were similar to ours, where it was more common among males than females. And many of these cases of forced criminality specifically involved familial trafficking situations. Next slide, please. So as I said, in 2022, we underwent this specific research on forced criminality, and it resulted in this publication, A Case of Mistaken Identity, the criminalization of victims of labor trafficking by forced criminality. It was authored by myself, Julia Einbahn, who is the CEO of Covenant House, New Jersey, and Hani Stocklosa out of Heal Trafficking, which if anyone is not familiar with their work, I highly recommend looking into them yourself. They have great resources available, specifically around human trafficking and healthcare. So the goal of the research was we really wanted to learn more about the relationship between history of arrest and trafficking. Covenant House, New Jersey had done research years earlier that resulted in the first scientifically validated screening tool for sex and labor trafficking called QUIT, or Quick Youth Indicators for Trafficking. There's more information available about that on Covenant House, New Jersey's website if people are interested, or I can also share some resources that Annabelle can send out as well. So the goal was to learn more about that. One of the findings that came out of that study was that a history of arrest was an associated factor with trafficking experiences. So we wanted to learn more about that because all we knew was that they were associated with one another. We had no idea which one came first, or what the circumstances of it were. So what we did in this article was describe the characteristics, experiences, trafficking experiences, and arrest histories of young people experiencing homelessness who had also experienced forced criminality. We did this using solely existing data, so all of it was information that we collect over the normal course of business. What we found was that forced criminality experiences were often a precursor to arrest. So the arrest was not happening as a result specifically of the forced criminality, but was later criminalization that was resulting in this contact with law enforcement. And what we determined was that there was ongoing criminalization while the victimization remained undetected. Next slide, please. So what we found were that 64% of the labor trafficking survivors we served at Covenant House, New Jersey were survivors of forced criminality. For those of you who aren't familiar, at Covenant House, New Jersey, for our sample that we looked at 18 to 21-year-olds experiencing homelessness residing in one of our shelter programs in either Newark or Atlantic City. We found that forced criminality was more common among males than females. We also found that the demographics of victims of forced criminality were very similar to our demographics at Covenant House, New Jersey overall. Youth homelessness disproportionately affects young people of color. This was the case as well with forced criminality. We also found that 10 of the 18 cases in 10 of the 18 cases of forced criminality that we found, the victim was a minor at the time of their trafficking experience. This included 4 victims who were under the age of 12 and 5 who were between the ages of 12 and 15. The youngest that we identified was 7 at the time of their forced criminality experience. Next slide, please. So we also looked at adverse childhood experiences. So for those of you who aren't familiar, adverse childhood experiences are your adverse childhood experiences score is between 1 and 10 based on the number of experiences you had before the age of 18. The average ACE score among victims of forced criminality was 6.66. This was similar to the average adverse childhood experience score of all trafficking survivors served in our programs, which is about a 6.68, but was significantly higher than all youth served at Covenant House, New Jersey, which among all our youth, our average ACE score is about a 4.6. At least 90% of the survivors of forced criminality had at least one absent parent during their childhood. About 30% of those, it was that the parent was deceased. And more than half had been in foster care at some point. Again, we know that foster care experiences are associated with trafficking experiences, but this is compared to about 47% of all youth who had experienced trafficking, who had been in foster care. This information was important to highlight because one of the other findings that came out of Covenant House, New Jersey's prior research was that a supportive adult relationship was a protective factor for trafficking experiences. So if you have a young person who's been in foster care, has parents who are deceased or absent, has a high level of adverse childhood experiences, it makes that less likely for that presence of a caring adult relationship. Next slide, please. So what we found was that 12 of the 18 had experienced labor trafficking only, and 6 of the 18 had experienced labor and sex trafficking. In 4 of those 6 cases of labor and sex trafficking, It was a multiple exploitation where there was sex and labor trafficking going on simultaneously. 2 of the cases there were unrelated experiences of sex and labor trafficking. The most common underlying crime overwhelmingly was drug distribution or involvement in the drug trade. It's worth noting that there was an absence of a discernible pattern with relationship to the trafficker. It was sort of all over the place, which can really make trafficking more difficult to identify for law enforcement. And it was similar for the means of control. So there was really no discernible pattern in the method of force, fraud, or coercion the trafficker used. Next slide, please. An unexpected finding that came out of this study, because we were using existing data sets, was how many of the survivors of forced criminality had had experiences as a parent before the age of 22. So 47% had identified having at least one child by age 22. This is compared to only 18% of youth who had experienced trafficking and 14% of all youth. So this is likely something we wouldn't have found that would have been a part of maybe a survey that was administered, but we were able to identify because of using existing data sets. Next slide, please. It's worth noting that none of the victims of forced criminality had ever been identified by law enforcement. So only we had temporality information available for 12 of 15 youth who had experienced arrest and had experienced forced criminality. And only 3 were even possibly charged for what the crimes that they were forced to commit. 83% of the forced criminality victims had experienced arrest before age 22, and 75% of those had experienced forced criminality before their arrest. Again, at least 8 of those 9, the forced criminality or the arrest was unrelated to their forced criminality. There was one situation where it was a juvenile charge that was likely related to the forced criminality experience, but we were unable to determine that with any level of certainty. And all 9 of these were between the ages of 7 and 15 at the time of their trafficking, including 4 who were under the age of 10. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we found was that experiences of poverty and homelessness were overwhelmingly the young person's entry to criminalization. So their average age that the survivors of forced criminality had first left home was 14.7, and two-thirds had experiences of unsheltered homelessness. Of the 6 of the 8 victims who experienced forced criminality before arrest, their initial arrests were for low-level crimes of poverty. So things like loitering, fare evasion, disorderly conduct, driving offenses. And then these charges would accumulate. The young people would often go on to accumulate additional charges and consequences for not paying fines and open warrants, and then go on to receive increasingly severe charges and consequences related to unresolved warrants. So what we really saw here is that these young people were never identified as victims by law enforcement, and that their entry into experiencing criminalization was overwhelmingly related to experiences of poverty and homelessness. And with that, I will turn it back over to Annabelle, and looking forward to speaking with you all more in a bit.
Thank you, Caitlin. I would highly encourage everyone here to read the studies from Covenant House specifically on these issues, because I found them very helpful as I was doing my research for my white paper on the issue. And I wanted to turn it over to James now. James, can you please touch a little bit on the intersection between youth who are gang involved and labor trafficking by forced criminality, and the challenges that you see in identifying youth who might be seen as being gang involved or as survivors of labor trafficking by forced criminality?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Annabelle, and also thank you to the great work that the clinic does at Loyola University. The report is really incredible if folks haven't had a chance to read that. I'm James Dold. I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. We can go to the next slide. So I actually want to pick up on a point that Caitlin spent a lot of time talking about, because I think that this is a critical point of understanding of who the kids are who become gang involved, and then who the kids are who become victims of forced criminality within the context of gangs. Caitlin talked a lot about adverse childhood experiences and some of the surveys that Covenant House has done over the years with their victim population. And I was struck listening to her because I actually had never heard that data before. And at Human Rights for Kids, we have spent the last couple of years conducting several similar surveys of people who are currently incarcerated in prisons across the country for crimes that they committed as children. And we've begun to put together a compilation of what that data has basically educated us about. And so as you can see on the screen here, we have a number of adverse childhood experiences, both that are sort of community-based as well as home-based. And one of the things that we found in our outreach to folks who are sort of what we call deep-end kids, kids who end up being tried as adults and remain incarcerated for those offenses, is that they experience severe rates of trauma. So Caitlin mentioned that the average ACE score of the children that are served through Covenant House is 6.66. So in our survey, we actually found that the average ACE score of people still incarcerated for crimes that they committed as children is 6.33 out of 10, right? With over 72% having been victims of physical abuse, 72% being victims of emotional abuse, and 37% being victims of sexual abuse. And these numbers are significant because the primary population that we're talking about are boys, though there are some girls that are included within this data set. But the number and the rate of trauma amongst this population is something that we haven't typically paid close attention to over the years. And another number that jumped out to me that Caitlin referenced was the rate of parental separation as well, where we found that close to 90%, it was about 85% of all the youth that were surveyed came from essentially single parent homes, with more than 70% of those individuals having been having a parent who was incarcerated. And that's significant in the context of this broader conversation because the kids who end up being exploited by gangs, the kids who end up joining gangs, essentially are kids who come from disinvested communities. They're kids who have extreme trauma backgrounds, right? It's the same exact demographic profile that we look at when we talk generally about human trafficking. There's generally a target population that ends up being exploited, and it's people who come from impoverished backgrounds. It's people who come from, again, prior victimization, because that's what makes people vulnerable and susceptible to exploitation in the first place. And so when we're talking about gang-involved youth, it's really important to understand that we're really fundamentally talking about youth who are incredibly vulnerable. Next slide. I don't know if we're okay with the slide still. If not, I can just kind of keep going and then you can catch up once we can get those back on screen. But on the next slide that I wanted to talk about, what does forced fraud or coercion look like for victims of forced criminality in the context of gang-involved trafficking? And in many ways, a lot of the elements of forced fraud or coercion that we typically talk about in forced labor trafficking situations are also prevalent amongst gang-involved youth. That is, we're looking at threats of violence or retribution, physical abuse, physical violence that's used, threats against one's family, sometimes debt bondage. It's not uncommon to see children who end up joining gangs or being a part of gangs in order to pay off a debt associated with a family member. It could be something that a child, a sibling or a parent owes to a gang, including a drug debt or something like that. We also see, especially with girls, forms of sexual violence as well. But it's all of those things that we typically see in the context of other forms of human trafficking. One thing that I'll note here, and this really gets at sort of the subjective victim standard. We look at, what constitutes a serious threat, and looking at a situation through the eyes of a particular young person or particular child. And this is it's really important to understand sort of the background and history of a child who ends up joining a gang, because as we'll see later in some of my slides, about a third of all gang members in the U.S. and this data set's kind of dated at this point, but the last known reliable data set that we had, it was about a third of all U.S. gang members were children, which meant that 2/3 were over the age of 18. Typically, there's a hierarchical structure within gangs in the U.S., and that includes sort of common street level gangs, right? The leaders of gangs typically tend to be older adult men in their late 20s, early 30s, sometimes all the way up until their 40s. I think that bucks sort of the traditional understanding of what gang leadership and hierarchy looks like, right? And so within those sorts of hierarchical systems, kids who end up being recruited and joining gangs, number one, they're sort of looking for love, protection, belonging. They want to be a part of something where they've maybe known no structure, right? If we're talking about kids who come from broken homes or broken communities, they're looking for all of those very basic human functions that everyone strives for: protection, belonging, etc. And within that sort of setting, it's very easy for a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old kid to feel intimidated when, a 25, 30, 35, 40-year-old adult tells them to do something. And part of that is, the existence of these power imbalances, right? Inherently, children defer to the authority of older adults. But there's also other dynamics at play, right? Particularly in sort of violent settings such as gangs, right? In terms of the rules of operation and what is required of a child first to join a gang, but then also to maintain themselves within that gang structure. And so here, I don't know if we're okay to show the video that we have, but there's a video I want to show here that really kind of gets at this point of how gangs facilitate and compel members to carry out acts of violence. And so I want to put a disclaimer out. What you're going to see is, very graphic. It's very violent. To kind of set the tone here, what you're going to see is a gang punishment, otherwise known as a violation, being carried out against a gang member who refused to comply with their gang leader's order to carry out a drive-by shooting against a rival gang member, right? So they get back to their location where they all hang out, and this individual has refused to engage in an act of violence against the rival gang, and you're going to see, what happens as a result in the message that's sent to all of the other gang members. So we can go ahead and begin to play that video. And there's sound associated too, if we're able to get the sound up.
We're having some technical difficulties, so is it okay without the sound, James?
Sure, I can narrate a little bit. And so as you guys can see on the screen, all of the other gang members at the direction of the gang leaders are, beating this individual who refused to carry out the leader's orders. Now, the leaders are in the far left-hand corner of your screen, so they're at the very top. They're the ones that aren't engaged in any of the physical violence against this individual. There's going to be a moment here that's coming up around the 110, 115 mark where you're going to start to see these individuals begin to lighten up. They're going to start to walk away a little bit, and then they're going to come back and continue out the beating. And what happens in that moment is that the gang leader, and here you'll start to see it here just in a second, and I'll narrate what is specifically said by the gang leaders. You see them start to walk away here, then they go back. What is being said is, don't stop, don't stop. Nobody told you to stop. Anybody who stops is going to get hit too. And so these kids go back and they continue to carry out, the what's known as the violation against this individual. So you can go ahead and stop the video there. This is important because this is sort of a pattern of practice, right? So it sends a message to the individual who, failed to comply with the leader's orders that if you do this again, if you don't carry out an act of violence or you don't carry out any sort of order, crime, whatever it might be that we've ordered you to do, you are going to be beat just the same, if not worse, the next time. It also sends a message to all of the other members, as the gang leaders specifically state, that if you don't do what we tell you, you're going to be next to get beat up, right? And that is the classical textbook definition of the use of force or coercion to compel labor or services. And in this case, the gang leaders are compelling everyone who's involved to commit an act of battery and assault on a fellow gang member, and as well as creating a pattern of practice that instills fear in people that if they don't carry out any sort of order, that they'll be the next to feel that same sort of punishment. And so it's really important to understand the structures and hierarchies of gangs and how they operate. Now you can imagine, if you're a very young child within this setting, right, 12, 13, 14 years old, you're going to be scared to death, right? You don't want to be beat. And so anything that you do thereafter really qualifies you as a victim of forced criminality. And this is where it's really important that we ask discerning questions of children who are gang involved to understand, what gang are they a part of? Who the leadership is. Is there an older adult who's sort of giving out the orders here? Is there this power imbalance? And are dynamics like this happening on a frequent and regular basis, so much so that we can reasonably infer that there's an instillment of fear upon the child or anybody for that matter, right? Because it's not just children who can be victims of forced criminality in this context. Like all of these individuals who are carrying out the order of the gang leaders, right? When they're told, hey, if you stop beating them, you're going to be next to get beaten. At that point, they also become victims of forced criminality, right? They are being compelled to engage in an act of violence against a fellow gang member out of fear that they will then be beat next. Please go to the next slide. And I'm gonna jump around here a little bit because I know I'm bumping up against time and I want to be respectful. This slide here, I just wanted to highlight the similarities between child soldiers in developing nations and children in gangs here in the U.S. context. There's a lot of similarities, both in terms of the backgrounds in which these kids come from, as well as their own perceptions of their use of agencies. Most children who are in gangs, or people in gangs for that matter, view themselves as acting with a large degree of agency, of making direct choices, not too dissimilar to what we see for a lot of trafficking victims in other similar situations, right? And that includes sex trafficking victims as well as labor trafficking victims, people feeling like, oh, like I am making conscious choices, right? But when you're talking about kids who come from a certain background, who've gone through certain experiences, when there's a pattern of practice that instills fear in them, the ability to make a conscious choice is significantly diminished to the point where we no longer recognize that child or that person as being capable of making a conscious decision. And at that point, somebody else is pulling the strings, that they're a victim of exploitation. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide as well. And there's just some common examples that I want to run through. There are a lot of kids who are exploited by gangs, cartels, through drug trafficking. The report that Loyola recently put out, I think, is a textbook example of that. A lot of times these kids are mistaken for, kids who are making the decision to deal drugs. But as we've just sort of seen, when you have that sort of pattern of practice, they don't really have much of a choice. There's a lot of other examples, though, of different types of crimes that kids can commit. They include battery, assault, like we saw. It could include a drive-by shooting. It could include severe acts of violence, up to and including murder. It's not uncommon for cartels to use children as assassins or to help with the carrying and delivering of weapons or ammunition. So pretty much any crime under the sun, could be something that a child or a person is forced to commit that would qualify them as a victim of human trafficking through forced criminality. And there's a lot of sex trafficking victims who are dual sex and labor trafficking that Caitlin also mentioned, who qualify as victims of forced criminality, right? And so we see this in the context. There was a very famous case in California of a young woman who recently came home from prison after serving 10 years, where she was, forced into prostitution as a child, and then her trafficker forced her to help kidnap and rob a John, and she got a 10-year sentence for the kidnapping and the robbing of that John. And in that situation, we'd look at that person as a dual victim of sex and labor trafficking, the labor trafficking being forced criminality. Next slide. And this is a slide I'm going to end on because I have a few more slides, but as usual, I'm overly verbose and I don't want to take up too much time. I know we have some other presenters that have some really great information to talk about. But I just wanted to put this up for perspective because this is, again, what I was mentioning earlier, that you know, and again, this data is somewhat dated from the National Gang Center, but at the last sort of look, and I think this is about 10 years old now, there are about 850,000 people who were associated as being gang involved in the United States. 2/3 were over the age of 18. 1/3 were under the age of 18. That was close to 300,000 youth. You know, for us at Human Rights for Kids, we look at that population of children who are gang involved as kind of de facto being victims of forced criminality for the exact same reason that we saw in the video, right? When you have kids in structures that operate like that, there's no other way to describe what's happening to them than as a form of human trafficking. Many other countries around the world already recognize that to be the case. They don't have severe penalties in place for kids who are exploited through gangs. There's sort of gang intervention task force. Kids are provided with treatment and services. Here in the United States, unfortunately, because most of these kids are Black and brown, there's a tendency we have to simply throw them away, to label them as super predators. But the reality is, you know, they come from really harmful, traumatic backgrounds. They're further exploited by gangs because of those backgrounds, and we really need to be looking at them, you know, through this lens of forced criminality. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. I'll go ahead and end on this slide, and thank you so much. And Annabelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, James, for sharing that information. There was some information that was new to me, so I appreciate you. I learned something new every day on the issues. I appreciate you sharing that information. So next we'll move on to Aja. And Aja, what I would love for you to do is maybe touch a little bit on all the presentations that we've done thus far. And if you could highlight a little bit about how what has been shared highlights your own personal experience and how your experience would have been different if you have been identified as a survivor of labor trafficking by forced criminality, and if you ever at any point came into contact with anyone who could have potentially identified you as such but failed to do so.
Yeah, thank you, Annabelle. I think what I relate to most that the SJI paper and the Covenant House studies address is the need to increase identification of labor trafficking by forced criminality. I didn't identify as a sex trafficking survivor for 12 years after I escaped my trafficker, and it took me an additional 4 years or so to self-identify as a survivor of labor trafficking by forced criminality. Even after getting into this field, I didn't even know that I was a survivor of that. And so I think the need for increased identification is critical. And after learning what it was and knowing that my trafficker not only sold me for sex, but also forced me to sell marijuana that he grew in his home to buyers who were purchasing sex, that's what helped me realize and piece together that I also was a survivor of LTFC. How my experience would have been different if I'd been identified as a survivor of LTFC. I think if I had been identified as a survivor of LTFC, I think it would have made the greatest impact in how I viewed my own experiences and processed how things happened to me. My experience is definitely my own and everybody's is, but it happened to me so long ago, 14, 15 years before, realizing that I was a survivor of it, that I made the decision to legally pursue my trafficker. And unfortunately, my trafficker murdered a woman in 2019, just a little over 2 years after I came forward to pursue him in the legal justice system. He was in a relationship up in Washington with a woman, and he murdered her during their breakup. And so I was not able to finish that pursuit against him, but unfortunately, she was taken from this earth, and so he is serving a life sentence. But I think just knowing that piece would have made a huge difference, not only in how I viewed it, but also it would have made an impact when I was pursuing legal justice against him. But then given the circumstances and the fact that he is, away for life now, I haven't pursued him anymore legally just because of what's already occurred. I think that as far as child welfare agencies or other government agencies that could have identified me as a survivor of, labor trafficking by forced criminality, I think I was, well, I was already involved in the juvenile justice system as a youth. So that was my experience. This was back in the early 2000s. And as someone who works closely with child welfare now, I feel policies and procedures that address CSEC youth specifically have come a long way. Like the white paper addresses, there needs, there needs to be improvement and changes in laws that specifically address labor trafficking by forced criminality. Historically, California has done a great job of supporting child sex trafficking victims, but we need equality and support for labor trafficking survivors by forced criminality. Resources are currently more accessible to sex trafficked youth, and equality and equal access are prevalent. Not all youth are ready to discuss their experiences, but providing that safe space and resources for youth is very important. I personally feared that disclosing details about my own experience would result in a lot of judgment by the adults who were involved in my case within the system. I did encounter law enforcement with my trafficker in Oakland a couple of times, and he was able to make up lies in those moments and hid me during those encounters, and that resulted in my being left in his care, so to speak. And so, yeah, I hope that answered everything that you were asking, Annabelle.
Yes, thank you, Aja. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And Jimmy, I would like to now move on to you. I know that I read a little bit about your biography earlier, and it kind of highlighted your experience a little bit with labor trafficking by forced criminality. So I would just want you to also answer similar questions, like based on what has been presented so far. How does what's been presented so far relate to your own personal experience, and how would your experience have been different if you had been identified earlier before you got to your public defenders, to the public defender, that you were a survivor of trafficking and also a survivor of labor trafficking by forced criminality? And if you ever came in contact with any agencies that could have identified you as a survivor but maybe failed to do so.
Thank you, Annabelle, for having me here and inviting me to be part of this panel. And definitely, yes, I am Jimmy Lopez, and I am a survivor of labor trafficking. I actually left my house, my hometown, when I was really young, when I was 9 years old, and because of the lack of not having the opportunities I wanted to have, and also there is a lot of gang members where they recruit youths to be part of it, and I didn't want to be part of that, and I had to leave because I was threatened to that I was gonna get killed. Also my family. And I had to escape from my country, and then I had to trust borders, and I came over here, and I actually had a really bad experience by connecting with the wrong people, thinking that I was gonna get help, I was gonna get the opportunity I wanted to, and they also were nice to me at the beginning, but after I actually they had me on their hands. It was a total different story. So they brought me here to the US, and they brought me to work in a furniture factory. And I worked there for 2 years. They used to beat me. I didn't get paid for 2 years at all. And I got sick many times, and I was not able to see a doctor or getting help from anybody. And then I had to escape. I had to escape from that part. And while escaping, I ended up in a restaurant because these people they were chasing me, and then I ended up in this restaurant. They were gonna help me supposedly, but also just like the same thing. They offered me a help that were gonna help me out. At the beginning, they did give me a job in a restaurant, and then after that, they told me that I can make more money if I can do them a favor. But once that favor turned into a different thing, it was not a favor. It was something that illegal. I never thought they were gonna do that with me. They used me as a transporting drugs to different places, and then one of those times I was pulled over, and I ended up in the juvenile hall. I was there for 2 years. They treat me as a criminal, as somebody who actually does not do good things in here. and they were going to deport me and all that. And the judge and anybody and no agencies from here, they were able to identify me as a victim. And until I tried to kill myself, they figured out why, because I didn't understand everything and the whole system here, and there were nobody to help me out. And the attorney who the court appointed me, I talked to him. He brought me to their office, and he said that what was going on with my life, and I didn't want to talk because all the traumas I went through and everything, because I didn't trust anybody. And then this person actually treated me like a family member. He brought me food, he gave me a hug, water, and that's how I was able to talk. Because other than that, I mean, I wouldn't be able to talk, because all I do was cry and cry. And this person was an angel to me, because he called an organization which is called CAST, CAST, Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. And this organization the next day sent an attorney. That's how I was able to get out of that situation. And then they helped me out with the, to navigate the legal system with the, everything that has to do with to be legal. So I had to go to school and all that. So that's how I was able to pursue my traffickers, and they're in jail basically because they got a life sentence in there. And thanks to this person and these people that they are crossing my life, I was able to get out of that situation. And what would it be better? It was that the judge and the attorney should have known what was human trafficking. They only know what was sex trafficking, but that includes into in general, like the word we said, human trafficking. In human trafficking, labor trafficking, somebody who commit coerce, fraud, and coercion at all. I mean everything that includes on that word. So what would it be good is that the judge know that I was minor, and somebody would be using me as transporting or something, had an imagination why I was there, and why not searching where I was coming from, and why not figuring it out that why I was in that situation. Other than that, they were just judging me, saying that I was a criminal, and they didn't want me to be here. Other than that, if would it be without that person, I wouldn't be here. I don't know what I would be, either dead in gang, being a gang member or something, or not being here at all. So thanks God and these people that actually help me out. I'm here, and now I'm actually an advocate of child labor trafficking. The how to identify red flags that they can avoid going through that, like similar story that I have known. And it's really sad to know, because I went through that and I experienced a lot of stuff, a lot of insane things that it's unbelievable, but it is true. Everything that James and Eja that said is really horrible to live this type of experience, because we are the only one who knows what exactly is going through that. And with that, I leave it with that, and I pass it to Annabelle. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Jimmy, for being so open and sharing your story with us, and how it took so long for you to be identified as a survivor of labor trafficking by First Criminality. And when that happened, that was something that was able to change your life. I think we do have a question. Well, I do have some questions for all the panelists. So if you all would be able to turn on your cameras, I just want to ask you all, in whatever order you want to answer in, that's totally fine. What are some recommendations that you have for policymakers who are trying to address the issue of labor trafficking by First Criminality when it comes to youth? That they can, what sort of time you have for them in order to be able to address that issue and help youth? And then also, what recommendations do you have to service providers about how they can learn more about the issue, how they can identify more youth who are being exploited to First Criminality? So I'll leave the floor open for whoever would like to start off.
I can start. So in terms of recommendations for policy, and you know, I certainly don't want to be the person not from California, you know, saying what California needs, and I will not pretend to be an expert in California laws, but I think just a few of the things we think about a lot about how to better serve and identify victims and survivors of forced criminality. One is that if we know poverty and homelessness play a key role in the pathways into criminalization for forced criminality, then it's important that we're connecting victims to financial resources. So thinking a lot about things like victim of crime compensation and reducing barriers to victims of trafficking accessing victims of crime compensation is important in terms of policy. I always like to really highlight as well the value of ensuring, you know, there was a lot of money that came through the American Rescue Plan to improve services for K through 12 students experiencing homelessness. And so I think ensuring that those funding streams stay robust is a really important opportunity for prevention. The research is showing that forced criminality is really disproportionately impacting, you know, very young minors. So the value of ensuring that, and that homelessness is playing an important role in it. So if we can ensure that as soon as a young person is experiencing homelessness, that they're identified and connected to resources, that provides a really important opportunity for preventing trafficking and forced criminality. Another, I think, important policy opportunity is around diversion programs, specifically diversion programs for nonviolent crimes, and especially crimes that are often related to poverty, can really play an important role in better identifying victims and survivors of forced criminality, and really just adopting non-punishment principles overall when it comes to, you know, nonviolent crimes committed by minors. In terms of, you know, things that individuals who are working with victims or potential victims can do, one is that overwhelmingly, once the survivors of forced criminality were connected to high quality legal services at Covenant House, New Jersey, their charges were overwhelmingly dismissed. So it is of the utmost important that, you know, we're ensuring that victims and survivors have access to the legal services that they need. I also think that it's important that we just think about improving identification. So, you know, Annabelle, I know you touched on this earlier in some of what Loyola is working on, but just ensuring that when we're talking about trafficking in public or providing trafficking 101 trainings, that we're talking about that we're talking about labor trafficking, but also that we're really talking about forced criminality when we're having conversations about what trafficking looks like. And then the last thing I always recommend, and I'll share some additional resources on this, is the benefits of universal screening. I think part of why labor trafficking and forced criminality are often so under-identified is because, you know, unfortunately, law enforcement, medical professionals, social service providers, right? A lot of the time what those groups that are interacting with potential victims and survivors are relying on is these sort of red flag indicators of trafficking. So, you know, there's often a blind spot to labor trafficking and forced criminality in particular because of that. So we really promote the use of universal screening tools and utilizing universal screening protocols in places that likely interact with, you know, a high volumes of victims and survivors of human trafficking. You know, at Covenant House, we screen all of our young people who come through our programs for human trafficking with quick youth indicators for trafficking or quit, because we know that group is so at risk for trafficking experiences. So those are just sort of off the cuff a few of the things that I think are important to really think about from a policy and practice perspective.
Thank you, Caitlin, for sharing that. You've definitely given us a lot to think about. Anybody else would like to answer the questions? Aja, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm speaking to number 2 specifically, like at least in California, child welfare workers that I work with across the state. I mean, obviously there needs to be more recognition and support and services in general for survivors of labor trafficking by forced criminality. But once, we can get more support and services, I think that housing is a huge issue for the child welfare system in general, especially for any survivor of child trafficking. We see youth being denied placements constantly in child welfare. Different placements don't want to take in youth. They see them as a risk and a liability, more so than other youth who have child trafficking experiences. And it's unfortunate. And I'm mostly just speaking to survivors of sex trafficking. Not even, we haven't even grazed the surface in terms of like getting pilot programs for housing off the ground for survivors, youth survivors of labor trafficking by forced criminality. So that's a huge need, and that's something that we need to start working on now.
James or Jim?
Go
Sure.
ahead, Jimmy.
Oh, okay. Thank you, James. I just want to point it out on the term point where it says, how can I can give an option to, or either how can I help so they, the policymaker can help us. Basically, what I recommend is to look how out there anywhere we go, like how to recognize the red flags once a youth or somebody, the type of work or the way we see it, they look like. Because that's basically I was doing. Nobody would think that I was doing something illegal. Nobody would think that I was forced to do something illegal, or somebody that can learn about these issues. How to recognize a person when somebody is being trafficked. Okay, where are the common places we all go? Restaurants, markets, laundries, anywhere, we go on the train, we can see all this type of red flags when somebody, is being forced to do things that is not legal. So that's the type of things that we all learn how to recognize that. Or anybody like on the neighbor, anywhere can happen this type of issues. So we should pay more attention on that, because I mean I was transporting to different houses, and then nobody would think like, oh wow, well, and I didn't even know what I was transporting to until I was pulled over by the police, and that's how I know that I was trafficking drugs. Other than that, I wouldn't know, because it wasn't a pack. It was something that I was not able to open it. But I mean, like, that's something I can open. I can say from. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. James?
Sure. So just a couple of quick points. One is, California has some really great protective statutes in place, for survivors who are forced to commit nonviolent crimes. And I think that this is important because there's sort of an affirmative defense in place within the California code for those nonviolent crimes. The problem, I think, is the one that Caitlin raises, which is, and Jimmy as well, and Asia, around identification, right? And I think about policy with the little p, sort of thinking about the role that judges and defense attorneys and prosecutors play in more effectively screening those sorts of cases, particularly drug trafficking cases, for potential red flag indicators of forced criminality. because, you know, it's recognized under California law that those people are victims and they should not be criminally prosecuted, that they're immune from prosecution, in fact. And so it's really important that the law is implemented effectively. And part of that is, you know, the prosecution, the defense, and judges doing a more effective job at identifying those cases. Bigger picture, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, where we have forced criminality that includes violent offenses, that's where we still have a long way to go, for both juveniles as well as for adults. And this is important because, you know, this comes up in the context of, if you're thinking about like sex trafficking, for example, bottoms who are, you know, forced to recruit or carry out other acts of violence against other girls within a stable. Then you're talking about somebody who's, again, dual sex and labor trafficking victim through forced criminality. And it's important to make sure that there's broad protections for all classifications of victims, including those who commit violent acts. So at a base level, where would be good to begin would be to prohibit the transfer of any kid who is forced to commit any act of violence, as a victim of forced criminality. And then to also, you know, extend the protection of affirmative defense eventually to those children and then to adults as well. So that's really, I think, from a big picture standpoint, what needs to happen, because they're victims and they should be treated as such.
Thank you, James. Yeah, that is a very important piece, right? That there's only specific crimes where there is that defense for, but it's not for all crimes when people are being forced to commit crimes. So at this moment, I want to open it up for questions. I know that we have a few already in the Q&A section, so I'll read one of them aloud that I think is specific to Jimmy, but if any other folks have questions, please feel free to put it within this space so that and I'll be able to see it and read it out loud. So Jimmy, one question for you was, what is something that you're most proud of accomplishing today?
Well, it's hard. Well, there's a lot of goals I have accomplished, and there's many that has to come with. Well, so far what I have accomplished is that I have been able to give this type of conversation to Congress people. I have been to the White House and talked to them, to the House of Representatives, where I have brought these issues to them, and so far I was able to be in touch with somebody out there, and actually I was pushing from my phone number, pushing that bill to pass it over, and actually they did. That was many not many, but a couple years ago, and that was one of the accomplished things I have done, and still been able to advocating and get the different options, how we can help out there, how we as a victim can be open ourselves and tell the truth. What are the resources that you guys can work on for us to be able to come out of this trauma that we went through? And so far I have accomplished this class of traumatic issues that I went through, and that has helped me out, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to talk about these issues at all, because I didn't want to like come back to that time where I actually experienced all this, things. So I'm so happy and blessed that I'm here and being able to talk about this, so others can hear and learn about my experience. And either way, so from you, I'm learning from you. Thank you.
Jimmy. And this question, I think it's a bit more specific to James, but anybody else would like to answer this, fine. This one says, one of the pieces that makes child labor trafficking so difficult to address is the requirement to prove force, fraud, or coercion. When it comes to labor trafficking by forced criminality, would it make sense to reclassify any youth under 18 who are involved in criminal activity as automatically survivors of labor trafficking? this will put labor trafficking by forced criminality more on par with child sex trafficking?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. For a whole host of different reasons. One of which is, all the time we see, kids who, more often than not, kids commit crimes in sort of groups, right? They're very susceptible to sort of peer pressure, right? Which is why you see kids in gangs and those sorts of dynamics. And one of the complicating factors here is, you can have a lot of kids, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old, right? Like all sort of grouped together. And, you could have, and all of them get arrested, let's say, for whatever sort of crime, right? And the question becomes like, well, who's the trafficker in that instance, right? Are you going to charge the 18 or the 19-year-old simply because of the older kid? Or, is there a dynamic at play where there was an element of coercion or compelling the 16 and 17-year-olds to go along with the crime? And so that's where you have to be sort of very careful about, over criminalization, sort of being very careful about how you sort of approach these issues. My point with looking at the age disparities is that, the larger the age disparity, the more questions that should be raised, right? I think at a certain point, once you get to a kid, say a 15 to 16-year-old, and you're talking about a 30-year-old, right? It becomes a lot clearer in my mind that there's an exploitative dynamic there, right? Because at 30, there's some assumptions we can make about that person who's in their late 20s, early 30s, about their knowledge of the world, right? Their ability to sort of navigate adult situations that a 15 or 16-year-old kid simply doesn't have. And so it's very complicated for the same reasons that, we couldn't just eliminate the requirement of force, fraud, or coercion for child labor trafficking victims in general, right? Because 15 and 16-year-old kids can work legally in the United States, right? Now, there are elements where it becomes exploitative, but it's a very sort of fact-intensive inquiry where we have to look at all of the different dynamics, because there's an element of choice, right? And that's the question that we have to grapple with when we're trying to determine whether or not something is a form of human trafficking. Is there an element of choice there that we're willing to recognize as a society, or there are so many exploitative factors that we can sort of cumulatively look at and say, like, no, this person actually doesn't have agency in this particular case. And so that's why it's, I think, a very difficult conversation to talk about removing the requirements of force, fraud, or coercion across the board. But again, certain assumptions you can make once you start to see, an older adult with a younger child, and why people should be asking very fact-specific questions about what that relationship dynamic is like.
Thank you, James. I appreciate your answer. Would anybody else like to add anything, or I'll be able to move on to the next question? Okay, so another question that we have here is that in California, and some of you I know are not in California, but there has been a significant problem with large group engaged, but this could be happening in other states as well, engaged in small and smash and grab crime. Has this been connected with labor trafficking by forced criminality? So I don't know if there's anybody who would like to answer, or I can try to. So I think from what I've heard, I have heard people bring up this issue before about the smash and grab crimes, and how it does look like a lot of the people engaging in this activity are youth who seem to be young, but I have not seen people, the broader society, or people starting to look like that specifically as labor trafficking by forced criminality. I myself, because of being in this world, I definitely have had that question come up, but I wish, I'm glad that you're asking the question, because that is something I wish more people would be thinking about. And like James said, right, like that's why, and Kate and everybody has said, right, that's why it's really important that we are pushing for identification and for screening of, and for more awareness of the issue, because when this youth are going, or these people are going in, being dragged into the criminal legal system, is that something that is being looked at? Are they looking at the disparities as they're looking to see if there's any possibility for force, fraud, or coercion? So that's something that I'm not sure is being done, but should definitely be looked at.
I can just add too, I didn't have enough time to go into more of the details around the crimes that we found, but our research did find some of the instances of forced criminality involved. I don't have enough details to say about smash and grab, but they did involve like burglaries, robberies, shoplifting. Those were some of the theft. Those were some of the other crimes that were associated with forced criminality in our study.
And just to piggyback on that point too, that there was a recent, I'll put it in the chat box. I did an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun a few months back, and the president of FOP of Maryland went on record late last fall as saying that about 50% of all the car thefts that they were seeing in the state of Maryland were connected to older adults who were sort of controlling or coercing children into stealing those cars. And so, I think anytime you have any sort of organized criminal activity, particularly where you see it sort of pop up in multiple states, there should be a light bulb that goes off in law enforcement's mind about like, is this a coordinated effort? If this is a coordinated effort, who is sophisticated enough to sort of carry this out? It's not a bunch of 15 and 16 and 17-year-old kids. They're not like communicating over Instagram for multiple states. These are sophisticated criminal street gang networks, right? That I think oftentimes don't get the sort of the credit that maybe they deserve for their sophistication in this way. And so it certainly should raise a red flag of, who actually is convening all of this, like what is going on, whether you're talking about car thefts or these smash and grabs. There needs to be a much deeper dive to fully understand what are the dynamics at play. And at least in the state of Maryland, we've seen older adults at least implicated by law enforcement in coercive tactics that are leading kids to steal crimes at the behest of these older adults.
And I do see that there's more questions in the Q&A, and I apologize, but we are running a little bit like out of time. So we're going to be moving on to the next section. And then I will, if our panelists are comfortable, I'll share out their contact information. So if there's anyone specifically you would like to connect with and ask more questions of, I'll make sure that you have that information. But I do apologize, we're a little bit behind in time. So one thing that we did want to highlight is I hope that you all are taking valuable information from this panel, and that we would ask you that if you can, like there's been a lot of resources shared by Caitlin and by James and by myself. So if you would share those resources with at least one other colleague or two who was not able to attend the webinar, we really appreciate it. And then we also would appreciate it if you reach out to your local politicians. If you're here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors, and kind of asking them to address this issue. And I'll put in the chat a link to a sample email that you can use, or a sample graphic you can also use to share on your social media to bring awareness to this issue. And then I'll move it on to our closing remarks, and we can start off with Asia. Or is there someone else who might want to go first? Let me see. Jimmy, would you be able to, do you want to make your closing remarks?
I'm sorry?
Oh, is there anything you would like to share? So right now it's like we're towards the end of the panel, and is there anything you would like to share in terms of the last takeaway for folks who are here? It doesn't have to be whatever you would like to share.
What I want to share is that I recently experienced something that I was thinking that actually now is slowing down, but no, actually no. I see a lot of experiences right now since I've been having conversation with friends and people that I know, and then I don't want to talk about all this I can say the politics and all that, but under this president, there's a lot of people that actually are being trafficked now here in the inside, because there's a couple of people that I've been talking and hearing that they're having a similar experience, because recently there's a person that just came here and was trafficked, and now is in the process of going to court and all that. So what I seen is that we should all pay more attention on, well, specifically here in Los Angeles, that now that actually a lot of people are being trafficked and coming into the US, and a lot of young kids are in this are in risk of going through all that and going through all this, and specifically, like, similar things that I went through, that I've been seeing, and all I can do is, to help them and give the resources, the numbers of the resources where they can get help, because other than that, they're in the prosecution process, because this person was arrested, and now they're going all this process going on with the court. So is the, like, my suggestion is that we should pay more attention, more deeply on everything nowadays, specifically at this moment, because there's a lot of trafficking that is going on now that I seen, and drugs, and that's how I see that a lot of young kids are in risk. Like James said, that's when nowadays are using kids so they can smuggle drugs or other things, and then that's how my experiences that I have, that I can share with you guys, so you guys can pay and do more deeply researches on how we can identify all these kids and then provide the help they need.
Thank you, Demi. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Caitlin, is there anything you would like to share?
So, our article came out last February, and it's really been great how much forced criminality has been brought into the conversation. I'm sure many people on this call have seen some of the federal funding opportunities that have been coming out that are specifically about forced criminality. So I think it's really valuable that this has been centering on the conversation, because I think this is a group of survivors whose experiences can often be discounted, or who can, a group that's often not seen as victims. So, even when we first were having conversations about forced criminality, even those, who are very well versed in the field, would question, the sort of label of a victim. So I think it's important that we just kind of continue this work of talking about labor trafficking and forced criminality in particular, and making sure that when we're talking about trafficking, that we're ensuring that that's a part of the conversation, and really continuing to find ways to, identify folks, and making sure that we're really also keeping in mind, James spoke to this too, about those kind of really root risk factors, and that we're really, like poverty, like adverse childhood experiences, and really centering those things in the conversation as well. And just thank you to everyone for having me.
Thank you, Caitlin. And James, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, the last thing I just leave folks with is the importance of having a very nuanced approach when we're talking about crime in general, right? In this context, we're talking about labor trafficking by forced criminality. But one of the things that I oftentimes like to bring up to folks is that there are folks who come into the criminal justice system, whether they be children or older adults, where they have histories of victimization, right? But they may not be active victims. So you could have somebody who was a sex trafficking victim, somebody who was a labor trafficking victim, somebody who was a labor trafficking victim by forced criminality, but maybe they're no longer active victims, but they still live with the trauma of those experiences, right? And those are important mitigating qualities that need to be considered whenever we're trying to decide how to hold somebody accountable for the harm that they've caused. And it's something I think we oftentimes lose sight of, but is absolutely really, essential to understanding, the root causes of underlying criminal behavior, and then how also we need to respond to get people the treatment services that they need to be successfully reintegrated back into society. And there's a whole sort of spectrum there, right? Where if we're talking about people who are active victims, then we need to have protections in place so that they're not criminalized, right? And then the people who were former victims, we need to have protections in place that we recognize that trauma as mitigating qualities when we're figuring out how to hold them accountable. And I think that's something we oftentimes lose sight of in the criminal justice system, because there is this deep connection that pretty much everyone who's system involved has to that background of trauma and poverty and exploitation. And so those are the final thoughts that I'd leave you all with. And I know somebody mentioned in one of the questions, and I tried to answer this, that I put a link in the question to one of the studies that we published specifically on girls who are tried as adults who remain incarcerated in adult prisons across the country. A large number of those women, I think it was about 82 of them, come directly from the state of California. And so that information is available. We'll have a number of other reports that will be published later this fall that specifically look at the rates of trauma of people who are currently incarcerated for crimes that they committed as children, sort of more broadly at the statewide level. So thank you all so much, and really appreciate the work of the clinic in elevating this issue.
Thank you, James. And Aja, is there anything you would like to share? And I would ask folks, as you can see on the screen, there is a link to the survey, and I also put it in the chat, and it's on here for you, a QR code for you to scan. So please make sure you fill that out. Raja, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to unmute that first time. But I really appreciate what Caitlin said, and I'll just piggyback off of what she was expressing, is just the importance of, the fact that this matters. And, as someone who didn't, come in into this work as somebody who even identified as a forced labor by or trafficking survivor, labor trafficking survivor, forced criminality. I didn't really know where I stood on the issue myself, especially as somebody who wasn't identifying. But as I got to know more survivors in this work who are doing this work, whose experience were primarily, revolved around their experiences in forced labor. I think that it's really important that we just all come together and, understand that there's different traumas for everybody, and no trauma is lesser or greater, right? Like we all experience trauma going through these experiences, and we have to do the best that we can for our youth. Our youth don't always know what they need, and sometimes they do know what they need, and it's our job in doing this work to fight for them and to make sure that there are resources and supports in place for them. It doesn't matter if it's sex trafficking, if it's labor trafficking, and we just need to change that mindset. And every person that we reach through doing this work and are able to relay that information, educate, it makes a difference. So thank you, everybody, for having me.
Thank you. And it is 3:30, so we were right on time. Good job, everyone. I thank you so much, everybody. I know I appreciate you all joining us today. And like I mentioned, please fill out the survey, and we will be sending out later on a recording, and it just might take a couple of days. And as well as there was a lot of links that were shared throughout the presentation, so I'll make sure to get those links from our presenters and share that as well later on in another email. So I just want to say thank you so much and for being here. And with that, we conclude our webinar discussion. Thank you, everybody.